Okay, in this presentation I want to cover Rodrik's concept of the political trilemma of the world economy. And this is covered in his book, The Globalization Paradox, Democracy and the Future of the World Economy. Rodrik argues that there is a political trilemma in the world economy. That is to say, a tension between three different aspects, right? There's globalization, which is generally having a set of rules that govern the world economy and economic relations, having one set of clear-cut rules. Another is the nation state, and here he refers to having both sovereignty but also a central role, right? If the nation state is going to be the predominant political subdivision of the world, that's what he's talking about when he talks about the nation state. Democracy is, well, it's democracy, but at times it's in Rodrik's usage, it's not clear whether he means popular will, right? He often refers to this concept of democracy that, hey, the outcomes of democracy reflect the values of the population. Aligned with this is also a concept of domestic policy autonomy, having space in which to make your own decisions. And of course, that's a part of democracy if you have a democracy. It's also part of sovereignty. So in some ways, he splits up what international relation folks will often mean when referring to sovereignty of the nation state and the the policy autonomy that comes with that. He splits those two for good or ill. He splits those two up. So that will kind of complicate our interpretation of it a little bit. He argues, though, that look, you've got these three things. You can have a global set of rules. You can have the nation state. You can have democracy, but you can only have two of these things at any given time. That in order to fully realize two, you'll have to weaken the other. And I've got it here. I think it's an important thing that comes up in his book. He frequently argues that domestic politics trumps globalization. Might not always have done that, as we'll see with the gold standard, but that in the current day and age, or really for the last 50, 60 years, when domestic politics is compromised by the strictures of global rules, the global rules tend to lose. And here he takes issue with Thomas Friedman's concept of the golden straitjacket. Friedman argues that, hey, there's this set of rules that you have to obey in the international system, and it becomes a straitjacket or fetters, right? Once that international economic forces will constrain you to obeying these rules, but once you obey them, you're going to have strong domestic growth. So it's a golden straitjacket, or golden fetters is another term. Friedman usually uses the term golden straitjacket. Rodrik argues that no, this is wrong-headed in two ways. One, it's not so binding. Right? He points to examples where nations have tried to maintain rules that were clearly against strong domestic interest, the majoritarian interest in the society, and at that point, politicians keep their jobs, and so they will chuck the international rules. He also throws a lot of sand in the gears of this idea of this being golden. He says that it's not always a golden thing, and so he very much pushes back against Thomas Friedman's concept here. Now, Rodrik looks at the trilemma in history, and there are three basic errors he looks at. The first one is the gold standard, which is the era of globalization. It's actually the first era of globalization that occurred in the late 19th century up through 1913 is about when World War I brings it all to an end. And actually, the globalization happened. The gold standard was pretty much throughout the 19th century. A lot of people refer to it as the long century because it goes into the 20th century. The other two that we're going to talk about here are the post-World War II era, dominated by the Bretton Woods Accords, which runs up until the 80s, and then the current era basically goes from the 90s and is epitomized, is kind of demarcated by the establishment of the WTO and the Washington Consensus emerging amongst international organizations. So first, to the gold standard. Rodrik argues that the gold standard system favored globalization and the nation state over democracy. That is to say that there was a clear-cut set of rules that were effectively binding on nations, and that nations were bound themselves to, and that the nation state was a primary actor in this period. And democracy, not so much. Well, why did this occur? First of all, understand that the gold standard was a system where nations, and it's a monetary thing, we're kind of talking about trade, but it all goes together. Under the gold standard, nations fixed their currency to a amount of gold, and they were grains of gold, right? A certain number of grains, and they planted their flag there, and they said this is the exchange rate, and the system was based on nobody ever changing it. Very clear-cut rule, very binding, right? And that's the way this is, because if you did change it, then people would lose faith in you, your currency would be questioned, and et cetera, et cetera. There would be these economic consequences, very much your golden fetters, and they would have used fetters instead of straitjacket back then. Now, the problem with this system was that if your currency became undervalued, you had no way of lowering it. And why would your currency be undervalued? Well, if your currency is worth, 100 grains of gold, I don't know what that would be, but let's say it's worth 100 grains of gold. People value your currency based on what it can buy from your country. Okay, hope everyone's got that. Currency is worth what people can buy from your country in the international market. The gold, the equivalent amount of gold, is worth what it can buy in other countries, because you take the gold and you buy other people's currency, right? So gold is everyone else's stuff. If prices in your country go up relative to other people, well, the amount of stuff your currency buys drops. And if everyone else's prices haven't gone up, guess what? They haven't gone up. So gold is now valuable because the products, the exports of other countries are cheaper, and I would rather have the gold to go buy the stuff from them. So this could lead to the currency being undervalued in the world market. Today, when that happens, we have floating exchange rates, exchange rate goes down. Back then, it's fixed, it must not change. This is the golden rule, the golden fetter, you must not change your exchange rate or bad things will happen. All right, can't change the exchange rate. The central banks say, well, our currency's undervalued, so we've got to tighten our currency supply, right? Tighten the supply of the currency in the country, and which has the effect of, that's the policy mechanism. But what that does is essentially there's less money around, so prices drop on products and wages drop. So we get deflation. Now, declining prices might sound like a good idea, in some ways. But I mean, who you know, price, we see a lot of prices on computers, prices on electricity. We see a lot of prices dropping. Those price drops, though, are driven by increasing productivities, and it's cheaper to make this stuff. If the price drops just because the price drops and nothing else really changes, we got a real problem here, right? Companies have incurred debt and have wages set with workers based on the price they expect to sell the product on. The price starts going down, you got a real problem, right? You're going to have to cut your workers' wages, and you may have trouble meeting your loans. If you expected to make so much profit, but now the prices have dropped, so you're getting less dollars. Guess what? Your loans are now more expensive to pay back, right? Deflation makes debt harder to service. And let the business failures commence, right? So we got declining wages, pissed off workers, companies, forcing their prices down, then other people have to force their prices down, and they go. Basically, it's a vicious cycle that tends to lead to depression. Right? Forget recession. We're going to go straight through to depression. So this is turmoil. This is massive domestic pain resulting from policies that are aimed at meeting this external, international demand. And this led, by the way, if you go back and look at people like William Jennings Bryan, in the United States we had a lot of people who were in favor of silver. Americans wanted a bimetal standard, and if we had gold and silver, which would effectively increase the money supply for the United States. And these folks were being for silver came for being for policies that increased employment, avoided these, if you have money supply, you have increasing prices, you have increasing wages, you might have inflation, but, inflation's a much happier environment for people to work in than deflation. And so you have a lot of that tension from the 19th century and into the early 20th century really harkens back to this issue. So massive domestic pain was the cost of operating in the system. You had to just let your economy go into the dumper because you had to maintain your exchange rate. Okay, now we have this intervening blah blah blah, World War I, interwar years, and people try to get back on the gold standard and they can't. Great Britain famously tried to get on the gold standard and set its price too high, and the domestic pain was terrible. Winston Churchill actually was the guy behind that, and the Britain after World War I came back on the gold standard at their old rate, which was crazy. They couldn't maintain it, and and this is one of the things that makes Rodrik claim that domestic politics will trump the global demands. That poor Winston, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he pushed for we're going to go in at the old rate. It was too high, and Britain had all sorts of pressure. Like people started demanding that you run the economy competently, and the British had to go off the gold standard, and so that was the ultimate failure of the gold. They couldn't get back on it because when Britain went, forget about it. Okay, after World War II, we get the post-war era, the Bretton Woods, and this Rodrik refers to this broadly as the Bretton Woods Compromise. Again, Bretton Woods is often more associated with the monetary system. GATT, which didn't really create an organization like the IMF or the World Bank, nevertheless it was part of the idea, and so it gets lumped in with these Bretton Woods things. And in this system that was consciously crafted at the end of World War II, the nation state and democracy are favored over globalization. And the system allowed, still had nations in the driver's seat. Nations were setting their exchange rates, and the central banks were dominant. And in general, there was a view that nations would be very active in their economies, because that seemed to be the way things worked. If you're in, you've had the experience of the New Deal, and you have Keynes. John Maynard Keynes is very influential in setting this whole system up, and so we have a view that activist governments are good. Towards these ends of maintaining, suddenly there's this idea that governments should do things to maintain full unemployment, which was absolutely not the rule in the 19th century. Now, in this system, states, except for the United States, which is a very important thing about the Bretton Woods system, and I know that's monetary things and not trade, but all the states could devalue their currency except the United States. The United States was on a gold standard. We were going to trade an ounce of gold for $35 forever, and we were not allowed to change. Okay, but everyone else can devalue their currency, and there was still room for you to protect trade. And as GATT got going, tariff barriers were so high that there was virtually no trade going on. So you lowered tariff barriers, but you had room to negotiate and to move things around, and you weren't completely doing away with it. The emphasis of policy in that era was they were going for more openness, but what they were more concerned about was non-discrimination between nations, right? They didn't want nations to treat one nation differently from others. And so you have a unified tariff structure in the most favored nation status that everyone in GATT got. And so there was an idea that you can protect your domestic industries. We're more concerned that whatever protection you have, it's an equal deal for all other nations, because that's more efficient. That avoids trade diversion. And it lets you may not buy as much from foreigners, but what you buy from foreigners, you're going to buy based on the market on the most efficient folks, rather than on who has a sweetheart trade deal with your country. Rodrik argued that this was a thin globalization, or he argues that it's a thin globalization that sought, was seeking gains from trade. It was very much, we're opening up this system. The goal is to open up the trading system, while at the same time leaving nations with a lot of wiggle room, a lot of domestic policy space in which they could pursue whatever goals or protect whatever interests that their democracy stated, right? And so this is why democracy and the nation state are favored in this system over globalization. Rodrik argues that at this time we have one of the most massive increases of international trade in history, right? And we far greater increases under this system than we've had recently. Right? Now, you might argue, well, of course you did. You just bombed the snot out of every productive country in the world. I mean, why wouldn't they expand a lot? We can debate that. And in fact, just a personal thing, or that's professional. Broad historical analogies are problematic, because when you say, well, look at this era, well, okay, we can look at that era, but that era has a lot of causes. Our understanding of it is, unless we really quantify things, our understanding of it tends to be impression as much as fact, and there are a lot of factors going on. I very much prefer models, empirical models that look at things and look at a cross-section of nations, perhaps over time, but where you can isolate out different, you can have control variables, you can look, when you compare nations, if you compare nations that are more open to nations that are less open at the same time, whatever things are going on in the world, maybe technology has changed, maybe they introduce, new transportation technology or so. It's kind of happening in all those places at the same time. This is one reason why I really prefer these things. Now Dani Rodrik does a lot of research, so I'm not. He typically does that, but I just want to put a little asterisk on that. Well, yeah, but we still have to look at it and say, nevertheless, even though there wasn't this under this system, there was a lot of improvement. And I think, that's a valid point. Now, the current trilemma. Rodrik is very critical of what he calls hyperglobalization, and he distinguishes this from the thin globalization of what he calls the Bretton Woods Compromise. And he argues that this hyperglobalization, or this push for it, that he sees in the Washington Consensus, in the WTO, in a lot of the international organizations, he sees these pushes for hyperglobalization as threatening to favor globalization and the nation state, because the nation states are still very active, over domestic policy, right? And he would argue things like the Washington Consensus, or we might more broadly, he often refers to market fundamentalism. Typically people call it neoliberalism, which is kind of translating neoclassical interpretations of economics into a political ideology. But all of these things tend to crowd out domestic policy. They say, hey, look, there's this way we're going to do this. You're going to have markets, government is going to shrink, you aren't going to discriminate, you're going to get rid of these tariffs, and you have to do all the things in this Washington Consensus, and you need to liberalize everything completely for this whole thing to work. And he argues that this crowds out domestic policy, right? That when you have the system set up that demands that you completely allow markets to operate, and by doing that, you're negating the nation's ability to look at things and say, well, we value certain things. An example here. Thailand wanted to have a tariff on foreign tobacco coming into their country. They argued that foreign tobacco was more heavily marketed and was more alluring to people because of its foreignness and the marketing that came in, and that it was more addictive than domestically produced tobacco. And so Thailand said, as part of our smoking reduction plan, we want to have a tariff on foreign imports of tobacco, but we won't place this on our own. WTO said, no way. While we, certainly reducing tobacco usage is a laudable concern, you have alternate ways of doing this. You can restrict advertising in your country, as a lot of countries do. You can, you can tax based on nicotine content or addictiveness. You can, they said there's a whole slew of alternate policy alternatives you had. What you chose was to, use your trade implement, and you're discriminating against foreigners. And the big thing is that WTO we're now focused on you don't discriminate against foreign and domestically produced stuff. Rodrik argued that while that might sound okay, for a country like Thailand, which may not have really good policy, oversight, it could be, much more difficult to regulate advertising and make it stick, right? And to do things like enforce taxes on nicotine levels, and to have taxes domestically, as opposed to just the customs house is easy, right? It would be far easier for them, because they do have control on the trade, to tariff the imported stuff. And he argued that, and it's a problematic argument. I picked it because it's a problematic argument, but he said, look, you're ignoring their realities, right? You're treating them like every other nation, and you are impairing them in achieving a goal which I think we all would agree is a very good one. This is what he means by the crowding out. He also argues that one of the problems of hyperglobalization, or any push for it, right, because a lot of this is presuming that there is this push for hyperglobalization, is that a crowding out of domestic policy is not going to be sustainable, because in the end, when the economy is going in the dumpster, people are going to push back against the globalization. And he said, look, you're not going to win in the long run, and it's either they're going to push back and flout the rules, or what you're going to develop is massive opposition to the global rule. You're going to create conflict and tension. Now, so this is kind of what he's seeing going on here. It's important to recognize he does argue, though, look, one thing about this era is the neoliberal genie is out of the bottle, because the Washington Consensus, even though it's now being questioned, was largely institutionalized in the rules of the WTO and in a lot of agreements that we have out there. And so that really we're kind of stuck with a lot of those rules. We can't completely go back to the Bretton Woods Compromise, so we have to move forward from here, right? So the neoliberal genie's out of the bottle, but this is the problem we're going to have with it. Now, you might wonder, all right, we've basically had globalization being the variable of increasing or decreasing. What about the nation state? Kind of a lot of his argument when he places globalization in opposition to democracy, a lot of that argument is based on the idea that the nation state is a constant. What about the alternate reality? Right? Or an alternate, it's actually not an alternate trilemma, it's an alternate solution to the trilemma. What if we wither the nation state? Right? Why can't we favor democracy and globalization over nation states? The argument he makes here is that we have, well, first of all, there are all the arguments about whether it's possible, right? We don't have a government, and he looks at the various arguments that, well, we're having kind of social norms developing, and you're basically dealing with that problem of how do you get to supranational bodies. I think the interesting argument he makes is, even if it was possible, even if we could wave a magic wand and have a global governance, would that be a good thing? And he argues that when you look at the nations around the world, there's so many divergent interests of people, right? Some people want growth, some people want security. We have a lot of different values and interests going on in the world, and more strikingly, we have wildly varying circumstances. We have really, really poor countries with very weak political institutions, not even democracy yet. Then we have some democracies. And the democracies, they still don't have really good, effective bureaucracies and policy-making things, and they're dirt poor. And then we have people who are rising and doing better, but not quite there. And then we have all these other nations. We just have so many varied circumstances around the world that it's unlikely that these folks could combine into any kind of participatory decision-making system that would produce a one-size-fits-all rule that would be in their benefit, right? And so he just says, even if it was possible, would we want that, right? And so even if the mechanics were possible, would the policies that come out of this be desirable? Would they be democratic? Right? Would they serve everyone's interests, or would they go to the lowest common denominator? Or would they favor a certain set of interests over others? Presumably the wealthier countries, but could be anyway. So he points to the EU. He says, look at the EU. These are very similar states, right? relatively similar history. They're Europeans, and they're relatively similar in, their range of income is, I think, 1 to 3, whereas in the world it's 1 to 60. I mean, in terms of the proportions, he has exact numbers. He just says, look, the range, there is a range, but it's very narrow. There's a lot of similarities. Yet these folks have massive conflicts of interest. And, we're kind of seeing that with Greece and Spain and these other things and he points to examples. It's just that there's, what works for France and Germany doesn't necessarily work for Luxembourg, Spain, and Italy. Right, much less Latvia and some of these other smaller countries. And so he said this would just be magnified several times by a global EU, a GU, if you will. Furthermore, he says you don't really see the state going away in the EU. There is an EU Parliament, but the primary policy-making body is the Council of Ministers. So the nation states are still very heavily in the driver's seat. So, even the EU doesn't really represent a withering away of the state as much as it might be supposed. So his argument here is that, look, we know there's all sorts of troubles actually doing the thing, accomplishing a global governance. Well, heck, we wouldn't even want it if we could do it, right? So the nation state, he says, no, the nation state probably has to stick around. So what then is Rodrik's solution? Rodrik's solution. He argues that you've got to moderate the rules to thin out globalization. That essentially, for everything I've said or covered here, the supremacy of democracy and the irreplaceability of the nation state are going to necessitate a thinning out of globalization. Now, how do you do this? He has some ideas on this, primarily that you have to allow nations to opt out of rules. If you're going to have rules, and we already have them, right? So it's the thing, we already got the rules. That you need to allow nations to opt out of the rules if they can make a policy case for doing so, right? And he argues that the WTO process for reviewing what nations do, because there are clauses that allow people, there are things in there already that allow people to make policies. However, the review process in place involves second guessing the policy, and very often it applies it looks at the policy and says, all right, is this based in science, right? Are we looking at this rule? It looks at and it says, is this a good decision, right? Is there a basis in science for you to? One great example is the hormone-fed beef that the EU wanted to prohibit any hormone-fed beef from coming into their country because they prohibited hormones from being used domestically, and so they said, and so it wasn't a case they were going to apply the thing across the board, right? But the WTO said, look, there is no scientific basis for you to think hormones are bad, and so out of here. However, Rodrik argues, well, but it was a decision they made. I mean, they applied it on themselves, and they were applying a standard of precaution, right? It's not that there's no evidence that the hormone stuff is bad, so you can't ban it. They were saying, well, we don't have enough evidence that it's safe, so we're going to err on the side of caution. Okay. Rodrik says, look, what you need to do is review the process that went into this. Was it a good process? Did they, did they state out a goal? Did they seek input? And did they, from everyone involved, did they weigh the facts in the process? And so he said, look, review the process, not the outcome of the process, right? Because different people could look at the same data and disagree. And so he says, we got to do this. Now, this is, in some ways, when I hear him talk, or when I read him talking about this, it's kind of like, wow, he has a thing, are all the interested parties included in the process? Was the evidence raised? And I'm like, he's got some idea. I don't know what political process does that. Political processes are just that. They're political, and they're messy, and there's a lot of different things go. So as a political scientist, I was like, wow, you have an almost naive view of policy-making processes that, so I'm questionable whether his standard can be applied, but that's what he's arguing for. He also argues that non-democracies, because they're non-democracies, should have less of a presumption that their policy making is designed to benefit the society as a whole, and so they should be subject to more review. They should be second-guessed. And so he wants to divide out the review that's given to democracies or non-democracies, which is problematic, although, see, I don't disagree with it nearly as much. Because, yeah, non-democracies, we know a non-democracy is going to be, from Bueno de Mesquita et al.'s selectorate theory, we know that those processes of authoritarian regimes where there's a smaller winning coalition are going to be focused on providing private benefits, not public benefits. And there you go. So this would be, however, a different thing. And so Rodrik is placing a lot of emphasis on the idea, let people opt out if they can make the case for it. And if they can't make the case for it, there can be issues, but, give them some policy space. This is a very nuanced and problematic argument. He's probably absolutely right, but very difficult. It's kind of very difficult to see in place. But I think that it's worth keeping in our minds here. In terms of nations, Rodrik makes the argument that, look, nations should not be trying to buy into a one-size-fits-all model of free markets and all that. The Washington Consensus is a really long list of policy reforms. You have to put them all into play to let the free market work, and etc. Rodrik says, rather than trying to take this holistic approach, which is very difficult and may open people up to a lot of problems, unintended or unexpected problems, he argues nations should focus on sequentially removing the worst bottlenecks to trade rather than reforming their whole system. And he says, go and say, what's the thing that's blocking you the most from expanding trade? And then fix it. And then once that's fixed, something else will become the worst bottleneck. Now you got to fix that. And he argues this is exactly what China did. This is the China model, where you say, okay, what are our biggest problems? Our biggest problem agriculturally, we have a quota on quotas and fixed prices. Therefore, the price you get and the amount you produce is fixed, so why work any harder? China says, all right, what we'll do is we'll let our farmers, they give us the quota at the price, and then anything they make above the quota they can keep and sell on a market. Whoa, and suddenly you're drowning in rice, right? Because everyone's, we can make money. And then you say, all right, now our problem is that we don't have property rights. Well, how do we get people to own property, and how can we encourage people to do that? And so let's create local cooperatives. And, just basically at every step along the way, the Chinese just, solved a problem, and then another thing came up as a problem. And so they solved that, and they sequentially moved through it. And he says, look, this is how you have to do it. Because then you're minimizing unintended conflicts. You're also, the laundry list of things you have to fix under the Washington Consensus is so big that it's just going to have so many people in opposition to it that, you know, even if you pass it, are you going to be able to implement it? Whereas if you do one thing at a time, you'll have smaller opposition groups, and you can just, you know, bury them one at a time as you go along. So this is his view of the world, and it stands as a moderate. He's heretical amongst the neoclassical minded economists. Milton Friedman would not be happy with Dani. But he is an economist, and he is out there, and so these are reasoned things. You know, he's not denying the effect of incentives or markets or any of that stuff. He's saying, look, this is what we need to do in order to move on in a way that recognizes this trilemma and will allow us to economically advance. And one thing that's not in the slides here that's, well, you know, he very frequently says, look, globalization is not the goal. The goal is to grow, to reduce poverty, to increase human well-being in the world. And globalization can be a means to an end to it. However, hyperglobalization can frustrate this. And so keep your eye on the goal, which is economic advancement, and recognize that the policy instruments to this are not always going to be, they can't be a fundamental ideological thing. They have to be suited to circumstances and differing values as well, right? Differing circumstances, differing mechanisms, and differing values in terms of what goals you're trying to maximize. That's basically the Rodrik argument.